Chapter 1. April 9, Sup/Sup, 1852. Mary's Journal, Kansas Territory. We are now camped on the Nemaha River. After almost 2 weeks on the trail, we seem to have found our rhythm and things are moving along well. I'm traveling the trail with my parents, but they don't know that I plan to file for my own homestead once we've reached our destination. I know they wouldn't approve, because they feel like that's too manly, but Oregon is the one place in the world where I can file, and I can live there alone. Already, I'm something of an oddity to the other women going west, thanks to my ability to shoot any animal that moves. I don't let it bother me too much though, because I do love the ability to do manly things, while still looking like a lady. Speaking of looking like a lady, I danced with Bob Hastings, the man Pa hired to drive our family's second wagon, tonight. The doctor played the Jew's harp, Herbert Jensen played fiddle, and Jamie Pruitt played the guitar. The men play, and we all dance, acting as if we're having a party every evening after walking 20 miles. We're probably all crazy to dance and celebrate, but the truth is tomorrow we may die. So far, we've only had one bad accident on the trail, and no deaths. I expect that to change any day, but I pray it doesn't. After dancing with Bob, he asked me to walk with him, and though I knew it would anger my father, we sneaked out of camp and walked along the river. I think we passed my dear friend Hannah as she was doing her laundry, but she won't say anything. She is the one person on this trail I can trust with any secret. When we had walked along the river for a while, Bob caught me by the shoulders, and he kissed me. I know I shouldn't talk of such things, but since I never intend to let anyone read this journal, and I may burst into flames if I don't at least tell someone, I will talk about it here. His lips were soft against mine, and when he pulled me against him for a kiss, let's just say it made me think maybe I could marry after all. He made me feel things in parts of my body that I ought not to mention, but I'm a farm girl at heart. Of course, I know they exist, and I know exactly what happens between a man and woman. I wanted to clutch his shoulders and melt into his arms, but no one would expect that of me. I'm a strong, independent woman from Missouri who is going west to claim a homestead. I do not belong in the arms of a young man traveling west to find his fortune. Not under any circumstances. After a very long day on the trail, Mary Mitchell sat with her family enjoying the music several of the unmarried men of her wagon train were playing. She was a spinster at 22, and she wasn't even a little bit ashamed. No, Mary was happy with who she was, and she was certain she'd never marry. Why would she? She could get anything she wanted or needed out west without marrying. There was no reason to sell herself into servitude to a man and his seed. She wasn't going to do it. She'd watched her mother and how difficult it was for her, having 8 children, and Mary suspected there was another on the way. Her mother had birthed Mary when she was only 15, and she had more childbearing years left. Though why any woman would choose to live a life of serving others, she had no idea. She sat with her family, watching the men play the music and feeling her foot tapping along in time to the music, when Bob Hastings stopped in front of her. "Care to dance, Miss Mitchell?" Mary's immediate inclination was to tell him no. She had no desire to dance or to make him think that she would have an interest in him of any sort. But she so loved to dance, and the music was flowing through her veins in a way that made her want to get out and dance alone if that was the only way she could dance. After just a moment's hesitation, she nodded, putting her hand in his. "I'd enjoy that, Mr. Hastings." He led her out to the middle of the circle with the wagons, and the two of them danced to the fast, loud music. He swung her around and her skirt flared out dramatically. It made her exceptionally happy she had remembered not to wear her split skirt that evening. Her mother would have skinned her alive without a second thought. Everyone had started clapping in time to the music, and Bob had taken their enthusiasm as a bit of a challenge. He pulled her in closer and started doing some fancy steps that Mary matched without giving it a second thought. He had a way of making her think he could read her mind, which made them good partners at cards, but it also made them able to dance well together. They danced song after song, until laughing and out of breath, she told him she needed a break from the excitement. "Walk with me, Miss Mitchell." Bob was always so cordial, but he hadn't made his interest in her a secret from anyone. Mary shook her head. "Oh, my pa wouldn't approve. You'd be risking your job." Her pa didn't approve of anything. She was allowed to have a man court her, but only if he approved of the man first. For someone who had taught her to be independent from the moment she could walk, he was a very difficult man to please. "Your pa never has to know we walked together. We'll just follow the river a ways, and then we'll come right back." "Isn't your pa on guard duty tonight?" Mary smiled and nodded. "That he is." "All right, you walk down out of sight of camp, and then I'll follow a minute later. No one will ever know." Well, they might figure it out, but hopefully her pa would never know. That was the important thing. Bob waited for her right next to the river, but the camp was on higher ground so they wouldn't risk flooding. She waited until he disappeared and then she left, finding him at the river, and giggling a little. "Let's run, and then we'll walk when there's no risk of discovery," Mary suggested. She knew she was too old to find so much excitement in doing what she knew would get her into trouble, but it didn't seem to matter to her. Mary and Bob laughed as they ran away from the others, and they walked slowly along the river bank. Bob made her feel differently than any of the young men her father had tried to make her marry before. She wasn't certain how he would feel about her interest in shooting, though. "Do you think we'll see buffalo soon?" Bob nodded. "I'll be surprised if we haven't killed one within a week." "Really?" Mary was excited. "I so want to be the first to bring in a buffalo." She wasn't certain why it was so important to her to be the first, but it was. She'd even been dreaming about it. "You do?" "I've heard you can really shoot, but I haven't seen you use that musket you always carry." Mary shrugged. "I've been a lot more careful since my brother shot himself in the foot. I don't know why he was even touching my musket, because he knew better." She shook her head. "I felt so bad." She still felt badly about it. Her mother now had to ride in the wagon with her brother and was unable to walk. She knew it wasn't good for anyone to ride in that bumpy wagon. "You shouldn't. Remember, I work for your father. There's no way he would not teach all of his children about guns. He taught me first, of course, because I'm the oldest." Mary shook her head. "I feel like I should be sitting with him all the time and making certain he doesn't get hurt again." Her ma would never let her do it though. His parents need to sit with him, not his sister. "Why did you agree to come west when you knew it meant you having to care for your siblings on this trip?" Mary shrugged. "I suppose, because I wanted to go west myself." She looked at him, and then out at the expanse of the river. "Can I share a secret with you and you not tell my father?" She wasn't sure why she felt the need to confide in him, but she had felt the same with Hannah, and Hannah had kept Mary's secret. Bob nodded. "Don't get me in trouble with my boss now. I need to have food all the way to Oregon." She laughed. Her father was giving him food in exchange for driving their second wagon to Oregon. "Well, I plan to get my own homestead when we get to Oregon. I think Pa thinks I'll find a man there, but that's not what I want. Why would I want to be married to a man and have him own everything I work for? I want to own it myself." Bob looked at her with surprise. "You think you can handle a homestead completely on your own?" "Yes, I do. I've done a man's work every day of my life, and now I'm expected to do women's work, and I don't like it nearly as much. If I can drive a team of oxen, why not let me? Pa is insisting I do women's work the entire trail, and I'm cooking and caring for children and helping with laundry. But I've shot deer and antelope and even a few bunnies, and when I do those things, I feel alive." I only feel like I'm allowed to be half a person when I have to tend the children." He caught her hand and stopped her, putting a hand to her cheek. "Well, if you ever change your mind and are willing to do a woman's work, know that I'm the man for you to talk to." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm looking for a wife, and I know we work well together. Look at how well we dance together. Look at how well we play cards together. I feel like you're the woman God made for me." His brown eyes were earnest as they stared into her green. Mary shook her head. "No, Bob, you can't think that. I belong with myself. No man is going to be able to deal with how much I love to do manly things." How could they? It made her sad to have to say it, because he was a lovely person and she cared for him, but there was no way he could deal with the way she acted. "Could you do both like you do now? You could help me in the fields, but have supper ready?" She laughed. "Only a man would suggest that. If a woman has a job outside the home, you would still think she needed to fix suppers. But if the woman does the same type of work you do, why would that be all right?" Bob sighed. "I'd milk the cows and collect the eggs if you cooked." Mary shook her head. "No, that won't work. Why should I have to do the same amount of work as you and then keep the house? No, if you want me for a wife, you need to hire someone to be my wife and do all the chores I hate." He laughed. "Hey, we're on the Oregon Trail, not the Mormon Trail." She giggled. "Glad to hear it, because even though I need a wife, I sure don't want to share a husband." He cupped her face in his hands. "Are you certain you won't consider marrying me?" Mary nodded, but she felt mesmerized by the look in his brown eyes. When he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, she wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him. His lips were so soft, and she wanted them on hers for the rest of her life. When he raised his head, his face looked dazed. "Mary, please." It took all she had inside her to say, "No. I can't marry you." She turned from him and walked back to camp, not even waiting to see if he was following. If she stayed with him any longer, he'd convince her. Never in her life had she been as attracted to a man as she was to Bob. She felt tears prick her eyes, and she tried to ignore them for a moment, but she found herself angrily dashing them off her cheeks. Why did Bob have to come along and make her change all the plans she'd been making for herself? Being a wife was akin to being a slave, and she was not going to be a slave to any man. No, she would get her homestead, and she would live out her days alone. Perhaps Hannah would give her one of the kittens from the litter her two babies were bound to have. Then she would have a companion that was better than any man. When she got to camp, she didn't want to return to her family, and the music was over, and everyone seemed settled. She instead sat in front of the fire, watching the flames and imagining how wonderful it would be to be loved by someone and to love them in return. But she must be loved for everything she was, and not just for part of her. She'd never been like her friends who wanted to marry and dreamed about their future husbands. She was more practical than that, and, well, she was busy shooting and helping her pa on the farm. Now, though, she felt like she'd been forced to be in contact with so many young men. Why there were more than 5 unattached men in the wagon train. There were many people part of the company she didn't know at all yet. Bob, though, he'd caught her eye before they'd left Independence, and he'd never made any secret of his feelings for her. She'd loved having his affections and attentions. But she also didn't want to commit to marry a man. How could she sell herself into a life of domestic slavery? It made no sense to her. She noticed Bob come back into camp, but he didn't even look at her, as he rolled out his bed on the ground and fell asleep. She knew he'd seen her, but apparently his feelings were too hurt to acknowledge her presence. With no desire to hurt another, she had, and now she needed to find a way to get him to forgive her. If he would. Long into the night, Mary watched the flames of the fire, and just before dawn, when she knew the gunshot to wake them all was going to sound, she crawled into the tent with her younger sisters and fell asleep. It felt like she'd only closed her eyes for 10 minutes when she woke up, and she groaned as she rubbed them. Her younger sisters, Annie and Maisie, were sleeping in the tent along with her, and she sat up. "Time to get up, Annie. Time to wake up, Maisie." Her mother had just weaned Maisie when they started on the trail, so Maisie wasn't used to sleeping with her sisters. Her mother had been unlucky enough to give birth to 3 girls. There were 5 boys, and Mary envied them the freedom they'd have when they were older, but the girls would only be allowed to help inside. She'd been an only child for 12 years before her oldest brother was born, and she'd experienced the freedom most boys got, but then it had been yanked away soon after her brother's birth. Still, Mary couldn't help but want to do the things she'd always done and been good at. Thankfully, Ma was on cooking duty, so she could go out for breakfast and not be put to work on the food for the family. Instead, she was told to get the laundry baskets and go down to the river and start the week's laundry. It was Sunday, and that was her favorite day of the week. Sundays meant they stayed where they were on the trail for one day, and they did the wash, maybe a bit of hunting, and they had church services. Mary wasn't bothered that most people thought it was ungodly for a woman to act the way she did. She knew that God was happy with her for working as hard as she did, whether it was men's work or women's work. She felt right with God, and she simply wished others would understand she could be a good person and still be like she was. She went to the river, looking around for Hannah or Margaret. Hannah wasn't there, which wasn't a surprise since she'd seen her at the river washing the night before. Margaret was on her knees beside the river, washing tiny little garments with a scrub board. Mary went over to Margaret, and she started washing her family's clothes, talking softly to her friend as she did. "Where are the girls?" Mary asked, a little surprised not to see the girls around anywhere. "I let them sleep. They don't need to be up early, and they'll have an easier time sitting still through church services if I let them laze about this morning." Margaret was a young widow with 2 active daughters. The girls usually walked with Mary and her friend Hannah, while their mother drove the family wagon. "I think that's a great idea. I noticed you and Bob did a lot of dancing last night, and then you both disappeared around the same time," Margaret said, a half-grin on her face. Mary groaned. "If you noticed, I'm sure half the camp did." "That's not good. If Pa finds out, he'll skin me alive." Margaret laughed. "Hopefully no one else noticed. I won't say a word to anyone. You and Hannah have kept my family going on this trip, and you have my never-ending friendship, and I will be your secret keeper forever for that." Mary breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you. The last thing I need is to be forced into a marriage with Bob Hastings." As much as she liked Bob, she was sure he wasn't going to be accepting of her ways if they became more than friends. "Hello, Bob," Margaret called. Mary shook her head at her friend. "Not nice to try to scare me that way." "She's not trying to scare you," said Bob's voice from behind her. Mary spun around to him, and he looked both hurt and angry. "I'm sorry. I really didn't mean that the way it sounded. It's pretty much what you told me last night. You won't marry me, and you don't want to be around me. I get the message." He turned and stalked away from them, and Mary felt tears pop into her tired eyes. "I didn't mean for him to hear that," Mary told Margaret. "I know you didn't. Go after him and explain. I'll work on your clothes when I'm finished with mine and the girls." Mary shook her head. "It's probably best if he realizes we're not going to be married. I don't want to give him false hope. It's not going to happen, and that's all there is to it." Though a tiny part of her wanted, for the first time in her life, to be someone's missus. "How do you feel about Bob?" Margaret asked, keeping her eyes forward as she kept scrubbing clothes. "I'm confused," Mary admitted. She knew her friend understood a great deal more about men than she did, so she continued. When he kissed me, it was like lightning struck my body. I was all tingly, and I enjoyed it. But the idea of marrying any man, and becoming no better than an indentured servant, well, that's not what I want from life. I plan to get a homestead in Oregon and farm on my own. Margaret shook her head. Why do you think marriage turns you into an indentured servant? She asked. I've watched my parents. Ma does everything Pa tells her to do. She only has any say over the girls, and not the boys. It's just not right. Mary wasn't about to let herself be treated the way her ma was. That doesn't sound right to me, Margaret agreed. My marriage was much different than what you're talking about. When I married, I had a baby within a year, and when that baby was born, my husband helped out around the house until I felt well enough to take everything over. We made all decisions together. Yes, there were some chores that I usually did and some that he usually did, but we were both always willing to help the other when their chores became too much. I think that's how a marriage should be. Do you miss your husband? Mary asked. More than I could ever explain. Tom was a good man, and he loved me something fierce. He never denied it either. He just made it clear that the girls and I were the center of his universe. When he died unexpectedly, the land we owned went to his nearest male relative, which was his younger brother. His brother gave me 3 months to pack up and get off the property. I had no money. I only had my 2 girls. She shook her head. I sold all of our belongings so I could have enough money to buy provisions for the trail. But when I get to Oregon, no one will take what is mine away from me again. That's why I want to go west, Mary said. I want my own land, and I want to be able to own it outright. I see that, Margaret said. But if you find a man who's good to you, like my Tom was good to me, I think you need to marry him and keep him around. No, my marriage didn't end the way I would have wanted it to. I thought our love was so strong that we'd die of old age in each other's arms. But that didn't happen. He was thrown from a horse he was breaking, and he landed headfirst on the ground with a broken neck. I didn't expect either of us to die for at least another 50 years. I'm so sorry. Don't be. I'm strong, and I'm making it work with my girls, but if I could be back on our farm in Kentucky with Tom, I would be there forever. That makes sense. Mary's heart ached for her friend, but she had no words to offer to make it better. So, think about Bob's offer. Talk to him. He's not a monster. He understands that you need to be free to do the things you want to do. I'm sure he wouldn't stop you from hunting if you asked. He might even let you give him pointers with your musket. Mary laughed. Of course, he wouldn't. There wasn't a man alive who would admit a woman was better with a musket than he was. Don't throw the offer of love away, Mary. Please. I'll think on it. Margaret finished her laundry soon after and went back to camp to hang her clothes, and then she'd fill a bathtub. She charged 5 cents for a bath, and she only gave 5 baths a week. Mary had been a recipient of one of the baths in the other woman's tub, and she'd been very grateful for the opportunity. Baths in the river were too cold, but there were some things you just couldn't wash with a basin. When Mary returned to camp with the laundry all washed, her mother helped her hang it. You left camp late last night with a man, her mother whispered as the 2 of them worked to hang the clothing together. Mary looked at her mother out of the corner of her eye. Are you going to tell Pa? Why was she asking? She'd been seen by enough people that her father was going to have the information before noon. Why had she left with Bob? She doubted her mother would tell because she needed help with so many things. No, I'm not going to tell him. I don't want you getting married yet, because I still need your help around the house. Setting up a new household in Oregon isn't going to be easy work, and many hands make the work lighter. Don't go off with Bob again or with anyone else for that matter. I might be able to make an excuse for you this time, But if it becomes a habit, your pa will marry you off, before I can convince him otherwise." Mary nodded. "Yes, Ma." She knew what she'd done had been wrong, but they'd only exchanged one kiss. One kiss may have changed her world, but it wasn't enough to force a wedding. Mary was annoyed to learn that the pastor had gotten the first buffalo from their wagon train. She'd hoped to be the one to do it and get some respect back from her pa after the incident with her brother. She'd have to find another way to do it. As she sat in church, fighting to stay awake, her mind was on Bob, who sat a short distance in front of her. She should talk to him, but she didn't want to. He was a nice man, but she just wasn't ready for marriage. Especially not for a marriage like her mother had. She wished she knew if Margaret was speaking truth when she talked about her own relationship, but how could she know? She didn't think Margaret would lie to her because she was a good Christian woman, but you never could tell who was deceiving you. Mary had learned that well before a girl should ever have to be suspicious of others. Trusting the people around you could easily lead to heartbreak and betrayal. And that's when she remembered that she'd told Bob her big secret the night before. She had to talk to him before he went to her father. There was no way Pa could know that she was planning to get herself a homestead. Chapter 2. April 10, Sup/Sup 1852. It's getting hard to keep track of the days now that we're on the trail. I find that Mondays feel the same as Fridays. But the day that does feel different is Sunday. Sunday is a day to rest the animals, to get the clothes washed, to hunt, and to rest our poor aching feet. Sometimes I pretend my feet don't hurt as much as other people's, but if you're walking 20 miles a day, your feet are going to hurt. There's no way around it. Too many people know about my sneaking away from camp with Bob last night. I thought only Hannah had seen us, but both Margaret and Ma have questioned me about it. Who knows how many other people know? And now I need to talk to Bob. I never should have revealed my secret to him, but he could tell Pa that I plan to get my own homestead, and I know that would end life as I know it. Maybe I sound melodramatic when I say that, but it's true. I must find Bob and ensure he won't tell Pa. After church, Mary wanted nothing more than a nap, but she knew she had to find Bob. As soon as church was over, Mr. Henderson came to the gathering. Mary had wondered why his family wasn't there, but it seemed Mrs. Henderson had fallen ill with cholera around noon, and she was already dead. Everyone was devastated at the news, and Mary went to Hannah to talk to her about what could be done. While the men were digging the grave, the two friends talked about who would walk with Mrs. Henderson's 3 young children during the days while their father drove the wagon. Hannah said she would make supper for the other family, and that freed Mary up to try to find Bob. When Mary finally spotted the man in question, he was standing at the graveside with Jedediah Scott, Hannah's husband, and the pastor on the wagon train. They were fortunate to have a pastor for funerals, and maybe there would be a wedding or 2 along the way. Mr. Scott gave a fine service for Mrs. Henderson, and Mary waited until the service was over, and then she wove between people to get to Bob's side as quickly as she could. "I need to talk to you," she whispered as people still moved around them. "To tell me you won't marry me? I think I've heard that somewhere before." "Oh, last night and again by the river this morning. That's where I've heard it." Mary closed her eyes for a moment, wishing she could run, but she had to make it through this discussion. "No, not that. People saw us leaving camp last night. 2 people have now mentioned it to me. I worry that you'll talk to Pa and tell him that I want to have my own homestead when we reach Oregon." He narrowed his eyes at her. Would that be such a terrible thing? He couldn't understand why this was so important to her. "Yes," she cried out. "You don't understand my father. He would insist that I marry before we even get to Oregon to keep me from doing it. You know how I feel." "Oh yes. You made your feelings very clear. Please, Bob. Don't talk to my father about me." Bob turned and walked away from her, heading out of camp. He had no desire to talk to her for another moment about the subject. He'd offered her love, marriage, and a full life. She'd refused. Why would he ever want to even look at her again? That afternoon, while he was sitting outside of camp, an odd young woman who was part of their wagon train, whose name he couldn't remember, sat on the ground before him. "Why are you sad?" He judged the girl to be around 15 or 16, and she had a dreamy quality about her, as if she wasn't quite completely present. Bob looked at the girl, not knowing how to explain things to her. She had a peppermint stick growing out of her cleavage, and he didn't know how to talk to her. She was odd. "I was spurned by the woman I love." The girl nodded as if she understood. "Miss Mitchell is a beautiful woman. I hope she changes her mind, because you would make beautiful babies with your canoodling." With that, the girl stood up and walked away as if she'd come to him just to tell him that. He had no idea who she belonged to, but he'd see her occasionally doing something around the camp. Why, last night, he'd spotted her in the middle of the area where people were dancing, her hands raised, spinning in circles. Most girls her age were afraid to dance alone, but not her. What did a young woman her age know of canoodling? He couldn't believe she'd said that to him that way. What was wrong with the girl? Bob sat for a while longer before heading back to camp. It seemed everyone in the entire wagon train was in mourning that day. Even the preacher's wife, who seemed so calm to him at all times, was crying her heart out. He hadn't expected a death so soon in their journey, but they had certainly seen human skeletons and skulls along the way. The day before, they'd even seen a rocking chair just sitting beside the trail, as if someone had simply walked away for a minute and would be back soon with a cup of coffee. He approached the wagon he'd been driving for the journey, spotting Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell. He wanted badly to talk to Mr. Mitchell about his daughter. If Mary was right about her father forcing her to marry if he found out she was planning to get her own homestead, then maybe he could use the information to his advantage. He'd wait though. The camp was in mourning, and he didn't have to be in a hurry. No, he had plenty of time to decide what he wanted to do, if anything. He would feel badly for betraying Mary, but if it ended with her as his wife, someone who would truly work beside him for the rest of his days, then it was worth it. He felt Mary's eyes on him wherever he walked that day, and when he went to get his supper from her mother, he felt as if Mary was staring holes into his back. He didn't pay her any attention though, and instead went to eat with Jamie Pruitt, the closest friend he'd made so far on the trail. The two men had even discussed getting adjoining homesteads, so they could continue their friendship once they reached Oregon. "I saw you go off with Miss Mitchell last night. You finally got up the courage to tell her how you feel?" Jamie asked. Bob shook his head. "I got up the guts to ask her to marry me. She told me she will never be a man's slave. She plans to get her own homestead when she reaches Oregon, and she wants me to keep the secret from her father." He took a bite of his food, and while he chewed, he waved his fork in the air. "Then today, she begged me not to tell her father that she was planning to get her own homestead, because he would force her to marry before she reached Oregon. Apparently, he thinks her ways are too manly, and she needs to settle down." Jamie laughed. "So, you tell her father what she said, and then you tell him that you're willing to take on the burden of his daughter. Preacher marries the two of you to each other next weekend, and you have a wife. I don't want her to hate me. I want her to love me." Bob knew he sounded like a lovesick fool, but that's what he was. He was in love with Mary Mitchell, and she thought he wanted her to be his slave. "I think you're being awfully silly about that. I sometimes wonder how many will be dead before we reach Oregon anyway. Mrs. Henderson seemed perfectly healthy this morning, and she's already in the ground. How does it happen so fast?" "I don't know. I know her husband and children are mourning her though. Heck, the whole camp seems to be mourning her, even the ones who didn't know her. She's the first of our train to die. Jamie shook his head. Well, I guess we all need to listen to Doc and make sure to drink coffee. He thinks there's something in the coffee beans that keeps people from getting cholera. If that's true, I'm drinking coffee and not water from now on. You haven't been? Bob asked, looking at his friend as if he lost his mind. No, of course not. I'm not a fan of coffee. I don't care if you're a fan or not. You're healthy still, and it's time to start drinking coffee. Bob shook his head. Doc has been talking about this since we left Independence. If it was the choice between life and death, you drank what would keep you alive, and nothing else. Like I listened to Doc. That man seems to think he knows everything about everything, whether it has to do with medicine or not. Jamie shrugged. I'm not really a fan of the man. You sure do make pretty music together, Bob said in a girly voice, and he laughed when Jamie punched him in the arm. I don't know what I'm going to do about Mary, but whatever it is, I'm not doing it today. I need to think on it first. Jamie shrugged. That's fine with me. After they'd finished eating, Bob took his dishes to Mary to wash, while Jamie took his to Mrs. Balling. Mrs. Balling had started cooking for anyone who would bring her meat to serve her and her kids. It worked out well for the unmarried men on the train, of which Jamie was one. The camp was quieter than usual that night, as everyone was respectful to the Hendersons, who had just lost a wife and mother. Bob made sure not to even walk close to their tent, worried he'd hear the children weeping and wailing. When he pulled out his bedroll and settled for the night, he crossed his hands under his head and stared up at the stars. What was he going to do about Mary? The woman haunted his dreams at night, and his daydreams as well. She was perfect for him, but he didn't want to push her too hard. Telling her father what she'd told him was not the answer, though if her father found out she'd been sneaking out of camp with him, he was sure a wedding would be forced. He'd never been a man who had wanted to force a woman to do anything, but now it seemed that's what he should do, but he wouldn't. The decision was made. He couldn't tell her father, because a shotgun wedding was not something he wanted in life. Asterisk. When Bob saw Mary the following morning, she looked as if she'd been crying. Whatever had happened to her, he was happy to think it wasn't him. She walked with her friend Mrs. Scott as usual, he noticed, but the two women barely talked. The kids they were in charge of played around them, but Mrs. Scott didn't open her mouth at all. While he was with the other men that afternoon, helping to round up the stray livestock, Mary grabbed his arm and pulled him away from everyone else. How dare you go to my father and tell him what I told you? Have you lost your mind? He's told me I have to choose a husband from the men in camp within the next week, and convince one of them to marry me. Bob stared at her for a moment before shaking his head. I don't know who talked to your pa, but it wasn't me. I thought about it, because I do want to marry you, but I decided I didn't need a forced marriage, so I didn't talk to him. Mary glared at him. You told him. No one else knew except Hannah, and she hasn't spoken to anyone in over 24 hours. Why isn't Mrs. Scott speaking to anyone? Bob asked, immediately concerned for the preacher's wife. No idea. She has been crying on and off all day. She was supposed to help with the Henderson kids today, but instead she let me do all the work. I don't mind, but it's not like her. Not at all. That's worrisome. I wonder if the preacher has had her see the doc. Mary shrugged. I don't know why I'm letting you change the subject, but I'm not letting you off the hook. I'm angry. Look, Mary, I swear I didn't do anything. I haven't talked to your pa since you and I talked yesterday. Maybe you should ask him who told him that you wanted to get your own homestead. Bob wanted her to choose him for a husband, but he knew she wouldn't if she couldn't figure out who'd tattled on her. Mary frowned. If I asked Pa that, he'd want to know why I was telling people I planned to homestead on my own once I reached Oregon. He wouldn't tell me. I'll ask him if you'd like. She shook her head. No, because he'd know I asked you to do it, and the choice of whom I marry would no longer be mine. She closed her eyes for a moment. The last thing I want is my father forcing me to marry the doctor. Or worse, Mr. Henderson. I know he needs a wife to help him on this journey, but I'm not that wife. Would you consider me? Bob asked, holding his breath for her answer. I'll be thinking about it all week, she said. You're the only one who's offered marriage, so I may end up married to you simply for that reason. I will have to see how I feel in a few days. He's given me until Friday to choose. Bob nodded. I'll be honest with you. I seriously thought about talking to your father about it, because I wanted him to force you to marry me. I decided I couldn't ever betray you that way. Thank you for telling me. Mary walked away, struggling to decide what she would do. Of course, Bob was the logical man for her to marry, and not only because he was the only one who had asked her. He was logical, because she was drawn to him, and she wasn't to any of the others. Hopefully, Hannah would be back to herself the next day, and the two of them could talk. Her mother would still be in the wagon with her brother, Jeremiah, so she would be free to say whatever she needed to say. After supper that evening, there was no music, but all of the men who were interested in marrying her had been told about the situation, and she had to endure talking to each of them for a short while. She felt like she was interviewing her future jailer, and she was not at all pleased with the situation. Before bed, the only man who she hadn't had to interview, Bob, asked her if she'd made a decision. I'm putting it off just as long as I can. Apparently, I will be getting married on Sunday, which means I need to decide by Sunday morning. If I kiss you again, will it help you decide? He asked. He was willing to put his head on the chopping block for her, if that's what it took to help her decide. No, but thank you for the offer, Mary responded, unaware of the twinkle in her eye. If you change your mind about that, let me know. I'd be happy to offer my services to you. Bob walked toward Jamie. The two men tended to bunk down for the night together. At times, they'd talk late into the night. Did you tell Mary or her father you were interested in her hand? Bob asked. Jamie shook his head. I sat with her for a while, but I told her over and over that you were the perfect choice. Bob laughed. Thanks for helping her decide to do the right thing. Jamie smiled. You know, I think the two of you belong together. No one else would put up with her penchant for carrying muskets around at all times. The woman is odd, but she really does seem to suit you. Probably because you're more than a little crazy yourself. Bob smiled as he rolled out his blankets and bedded down for the night, right there under the stars. He belonged in the outdoors, and his Mary did too. They did belong together. He only hoped she'd come to see it before she married someone else. Across the camp, Mary was climbing into the tent with her two younger sisters, who had been watching for her. Ma said to tell her if you weren't back in the tent soon, Annie told her. Mary groaned. I'm a woman, not a girl. I don't need Ma watching my every move this way. Annie shrugged. That's not what Ma said. The girl turned her back on Mary to get ready for sleep. Mary lay awake long into the night, staring at the top of the tent. How on earth was she supposed to agree to marry someone before Sunday? She didn't want to give up her dream of having her own homestead. Asterisk. Hannah seemed more herself to Mary the following morning. Her eyes were still red from all the crying she'd been doing, but she was at least interacting with the children. May I talk to you about something? Mary asked in a whisper. She didn't want anyone in the area to hear what she had to say. Of course. Hannah looked at her curiously. Is everything all right? Mary shook her head, trying to keep her own tears in. She wasn't usually demonstrative with her emotions, and she felt bad sharing her burden with her friend. Pa found out I was planning to homestead in Oregon. Oh, no. I haven't told a soul. Not even Jed. I promise. I know you haven't. That's not who you are. And I told you that you could tell your husband. The only other person I've told was Bob, but he swears he didn't tell Pa. Mary knew her skepticism was in her voice, but who else could have done it? Did you tell him while the two of you were sneaking out of camp on Saturday night? Hannah asked. Mary groaned. You saw that too? Had the entire camp seen her sneak off with Bob? As soon as her father found out, there would be no question who she would be marrying. Two? Hannah asked. I assumed I was the only one who saw it. No, my mom mentioned it, and so did Margaret. Yes, that's when I told him. Anyway, yesterday my pa gave me until Sunday to choose what man in camp I'm going to marry. I don't want to get married. I feel like he's asking me to choose who will be my jailer. Oh, Mary. Marriage doesn't have to be a jail. My marriage to Jed has brought me so many blessings. There's nowhere in this world I'd rather be than in his arms. Mary bit her lip for a moment. I know it's not right to ask you this, but I'm going to anyway, because we're going to be lifelong friends, right? Of course, we are. You can ask me anything. The marriage act frightens me. It wasn't really a question, but it's what Mary needed to discuss. Hannah would understand, because she always did. Hannah laughed softly. It did me too. And that's not a question, but I'll try to alleviate your fears anyway. The act is very pleasurable for the woman as well as the man. My mother's advice about the act was to plan my weekly menus in my head as I closed my eyes and let him do what he needed to do. She shook her head. Mary laughed. I suppose that would work. With the way she felt when Bob kissed her, it didn't feel like something she would need to do, but sometimes life surprised her. I have no desire to do that. I don't really feel comfortable talking about Jed and our lovemaking, but if you care about the man you're lying with, it is truly a wonderful experience. There's no need to close your eyes and not think about it. Just let it happen. Have any of those men kissed you? Bob has. How did it make you feel? Hannah asked. Like I was someone else. I enjoyed his kiss very much, but I told him I wasn't going to marry him. He's not been happy with me since. I can understand that. If you enjoyed his kiss, then I would marry Bob. The two of you just seem to belong together in my mind anyway. Jed has made similar comments. How Bob feels about you has been obvious since day one. If you feel anything for him at all, then you need to choose him. Don't let worry of the marriage act or being a prisoner keep you from marrying. I can't let anything keep me from marrying, Mary said ruefully. I have no choice at all. Do you feel anything for any of the other men? Hannah asked. Of course not. I'm not fickle. Mary wasn't one who had ever felt anything for a man before. Having feelings for more than one man now would be overwhelming for her. Then why are you even hesitating? Marry Bob tonight. I can't, Mary said softly. I'm having my monthly, and I don't want that to have to be a discussion between my husband and me on our wedding night. It would be hard enough to discuss it after they'd been married a while. Then marry Sunday, but let Bob know he's the one you'll marry. Spend time with him and let him court you for a few days. I'd love to see what Bob does as courtship. He may think he's supposed to attend to your every need. Bob's not like that, Mary said softly. I bet he'd take me hunting. That sounds like a perfect courtship for my friend, Mary. Maybe he knows you better than you think. Maybe so, Mary said softly. She took a deep breath. I'll tell him after supper this evening that I would like to marry him. I'll keep track of how he courts me so I can report back to you. I think he's on guard duty from midnight on tonight, so he'll want to go to bed early. Maybe I'll tell him tomorrow. Mary didn't know how to just walk up to a man and tell him she was choosing him as her future husband. Who could do that? I don't think it's fair to make him worry about your answer if you have made your decision. He's got feelings for you, and that would be toying with his emotions. Just tell him tonight, and he'll be happy. Mary nodded. I'll do my best to get up the courage to tell him. Hannah smiled. I think that's the right thing to do. How's Jeremiah feeling? Doc says he'll be able to walk for short distances next week. Within a month, he'll be walking with the rest of us like nothing happened. He'll always have a scar, but that doesn't matter much. It's on his foot. Mary would feel guilty for the rest of her life about the scar though. Even though it would be hidden by his socks and shoes, she would always know she caused it. Oh, good. I've been wondering. Mary looked at Hannah. What happened with you yesterday? Hannah took a deep breath. I'm not exactly sure why I got so terribly upset about Mrs. Henderson's death. I barely knew her. But I looked into her children's eyes, and I felt all the grief from my father's death all over again. Mary frowned. I'm so sorry. How old were you when he died? She knew that Hannah had a stepfather, but she couldn't even remember if she knew that Hannah's father had died. 17, and it was sudden. He owned the general store there in Independence, and he went to work one morning. He never came home, because he was shot while he was at work that day. Hannah shook her head. Then my mother married Mr. Gatlin, and he was not an easy man to live with. He arranged my marriage to Jed without my consent, and I honestly think it's the nicest thing he's ever done for me. That's terrible. Mary squeezed her friend's arm, even as she watched her sister step into a hole and yell out in pain. Annie! Both women ran to where the girl had fallen, and Hannah yelled out to stop the wagons. Stop. We have an injury. Neither knew how bad the injury was, but they could only assume there would need to be time taken to deal with the girl. Mary heard her friends shout, repeated from the wagons before them and the wagons behind. Even the wagons that were traveling to their sides had people repeating the stop. Mary knelt on the ground beside little Annie, and carefully removed her foot from the gopher hole she'd stepped into. She ran one hand along the Annie's leg, feeling a shift in the bones. She groaned. All of my siblings are getting hurt. I'm sure it's a broken bone. And Ma would blame her again. Why couldn't she take care of her siblings properly? She knew now she couldn't have children. She couldn't keep them safe. Hannah looked around and spotted the doctor's wagon. He'd painted a red flag that flew at the front of his wagon in case he needed to be found quickly. I'll get the doc. With that, Hannah ran for the doctor's wagon. Back east someone would have said something about a preacher's wife running, but here on the trail, no one seemed to think a thing of it. Mary removed her sweater for her sister to use as a pillow as she lay back on the ground. Can I get you anything? Annie shook her head, her entire face red from crying. My leg hurts bad, Mary. I know, sweetie. It's broken. I can feel it. Mrs. Scott went to get the doctor. We'll have you right as rain in just a few weeks. Mary said a silent prayer that she was right, and the doctor could mend her quickly. There had been too many tragedies on the trail already. Chapter 3. April 12 Sup/Sup, 1852. Ignore everything I've said about not being willing to marry. I have been given an ultimatum by my father, and I must choose one of the men in our wagon train to marry me. Whether I care to marry or not, I now have no choice, so all other entries about not marrying are now null and void. Somehow my father found out that I plan to homestead once we reach Oregon, and as much as my mother has told him she needs my help, I no longer have a say in the matter, and neither does she. I have decided to tell Bob this evening that I will be his wife. I want to blame him for Pa finding out, but I do know he's not at fault. I am for telling people. I really thought both Hannah and Bob were safe to tell, but they apparently weren't. As we walked today, Hannah and we were watching a rather large number of children, and we were deeply involved in a conversation about what I should do about marriage. Past Hannah, I saw my sister Annie fall into a gopher hole, and she broke her leg. The whole train had to stop for over an hour so Dr. Bentley could set her leg. I sat beside her holding her hand the whole while. Then we put her into the wagon with Ma and Jeremiah. I sure hope no more siblings are injured on my watch. The wagon has little room to begin with, and there are now 3 people riding in it. I must talk to Bob Hastings this evening, and tell him that I am willing to marry him on Sunday. He's the only person I think I could tolerate as a husband, but the idea of having any husband is relatively horrifying for me. I do feel like I'm selling myself into slavery, but the choice is no longer my own. I shall marry Bob whether I feel comfortable with the marriage or not. He is the least objectionable man who is available to me. Thankfully, Mary's father hadn't yelled at her with the new accident among her siblings. She felt guilty that little Annie was hurt, but truthfully, Mary knew it wasn't her fault. As they settled for the afternoon, she checked on both of her injured siblings, sitting beside Annie for a moment. "How's the leg feeling?" "It hurts. Every time the wagon bounces, it hurts more." "Why was there a hole in the ground, Mary?" Mary stroked her sister's hair. "It was a gopher hole. You see, this little tiny critter lives in the ground, and he makes holes to live in. He thinks the holes are wonderful, because they create his home, but people sometimes step in them and they get hurt. Well, those silly gophers hurt me. I think you should go shoot them with your musket, Mary." Mary laughed. "If I see any of those evil little critters, I'll shoot them for you. I promise." With a kiss on her sister's forehead, Mary got out of the wagon and squatted at the campfire beside her mother who was making supper. "How can I help you, Ma?" Her mother shook her head. "I have supper handled. This is the last of our meat, so perhaps you could do a bit of hunting tonight, or even plan to do some tomorrow. I think the whole camp would be thankful for some more." Mary nodded, grabbing her musket. Hunting was just what she needed to clear her mind and feel better about the decisions she was having to make. "I'll be back before supper, Ma." Mary kissed her mother's cheek and rushed out of camp to the north along the river bank. It was nice to be alone with nature. She had less alone time than she'd expected on the trail, and less than she really needed. As she walked along the river bank, her eyes were peeled for game. She had walked about half a mile when she spotted 4 deer together. Carefully putting her musket to her shoulder, she shot, bringing down a buck. The does heard the gunshot and ran. Taking a moment to reload, Mary shot once more and brought down just one of the does. 2 deer would feed half the camp, though, and she was pleased. She walked to the deer, wondering how she was going to get 2 of the large animals back to the camp, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Bob running toward her. "You need help?" he asked. He was obviously worried about her. "You heard the gunshots?" Mary interrupted. "Of course. I saw you leave camp, and then I heard gunshots. I knew you were either hunting or in danger, so I came running." He grinned. "Looks like you were just hunting." Bob felt like a fool running toward her when she'd just been hunting, but he wouldn't have been able to live with himself if something had happened to her. "Yes, I was just hunting." Mary wondered how to bring up what she needed to say to him. It felt strange to talk to him about marrying him when she'd already rejected his offer of marriage, but now she really had no choice. "While we get the deer, I have something I need to talk to you about." He nodded, looking at her. "Yes?" He did his best not to flinch away, praying she wouldn't tell him she'd chosen one of the other men to marry. "I've decided to accept your proposal. I'll let my pa know today that I plan to marry you on Sunday." Bob bit back the smile that wanted to spread across his face. Are you asking me to marry you? He teased. Mary huffed and turned to him, putting her hands on her hips. Don't you start that with me, Bob Hastings. She didn't know if she could handle him teasing her the way he seemed to want to. This was too sensitive of a topic. He laughed then, and the sound was happy, filled with pure joy. He wrapped his arms around her and swung her in a circle. I'm going to be the best husband a woman has ever had. Mary smiled. Put me down. Though she wanted to be held by him forever, she knew her father would not be pleased if he happened to see. Bob did, but instead of putting her directly on her feet, he let her slide down his body, connecting with her everywhere. As soon as her feet touched the ground, his hands went to her cheeks and he kissed her softly. I am very happy. Why don't we marry tonight? I'm sure the preacher won't mind. I'm sure he wouldn't, but I would. It's just a few more days. She didn't mention her monthly to him, but she needed those few days for that to all be over. Bob nodded, knowing better than to argue with her. All right. I suppose I can wait. We'll get a huge homestead when we get to Oregon, and we'll start a ranch. We'll work side by side, and I will even help around the house if you need me to. She smiled. I would be very happy if that actually happened. You've made me the happiest man in the world. I hope you know that. I guess I do now. Together, they walked to get the deer, and Mary couldn't quit thinking about what marriage would be like with Bob. What if I don't want a lot of children? She asked. If you know how to keep them from coming, I'm more than willing to stop after a couple of them. Really? She asked. You don't feel the need to have a huge family? I don't. I do feel the need to make love with my wife, so as long as your method of preventing babies isn't locking the bedroom door with me on the outside, I'm willing to discuss anything. He couldn't believe she was actually talking to him about marriage. It was like a dream come true. Mary blushed and kept her face down. She was a farm girl, and she knew she wasn't supposed to get embarrassed about people having sex, but she couldn't help herself. Maybe we can save those discussions for after the wedding, she said dryly. Bob laughed again, overjoyed to know she'd chosen him. Why me? Mary shrugged. I'm really not attracted to the other men. I like when you kiss me, and since I know kissing will be involved after we marry, then I think you should be the one. He frowned but nodded. He'd hoped she was in love with him as he was with her, but it really didn't matter. They were marrying, and she would fall in love with him soon. At least he hoped and prayed she would. The two of them dragged the deer back to camp and her father helped them hang the deer upside down in 2 trees. You decided this is the man you want to marry? Pa asked. Mary nodded. Yes, but not until Sunday. She was standing firm on the day she'd marry, and she didn't want anyone to even think of arguing with her about it. You are one ornery daughter, Mary. That's why you love me so much, Pa. Her pa shook his head. It's why you exasperate me so much. I'm good at it, Pa admitted. I can exasperate you like no one else can. Mary gave her father a sassy look. Bob stood with a grin on his face, amused by the antics of father and daughter. I guess I should go see if supper is ready. Her pa shook his head. You go sit down. Mary will see if it's ready, and she'll bring it to you. The two of you can eat together tonight, and maybe go for a walk, as long as you stay within my sight. He obviously didn't realize that they'd gone off alone a couple of times already. All right, Pa. She was annoyed that he still didn't trust her, but it was nothing she hadn't expected. She was marrying the man, and she hadn't taken long to decide who she would marry. She knew her father must suspect feelings between the two of them. She walked to her mother, who had finished the big pot of beans she'd made that day. I need 2 bowls, Ma. Pa wants me to serve Bob because he's the man I've chosen to marry on Sunday. She knew her father wanted her to get into the habit of serving food to the man she was about to marry. Her ma nodded. You sure you don't want me to talk to your pa and keep him from making you marry? Well, I do, but I have a feeling there's no point this time. There's no way he's going to back down. Mary wasn't sure she wanted to stop the marriage at that point. She knew it was strange, but now that she was forced to be marrying Bob, she was at peace with the situation. Ma frowned. It's worth trying. I don't like the idea of you marrying before we reach Oregon, because I will need your help the whole way there. I know you will. I still plan to help. Pa's not going to let me wait, because he knows if I do, I'll get my own homestead, and he'll never have the pleasure of seeing me married off. Do you have feelings for Bob at all? If you don't, I think you should wait at least a month or two. Mary tried to think about the right thing to tell her mother. I do have feelings for him, Ma. I'm not in love with him or anything, but he makes my blood boil when I get angry with him, and he makes my skin feel like it's on fire when he kisses me. I have feelings. Sounds like he's the man you need to marry then. All right. I'll plan to make a special meal on Sunday, and we'll request music. You and Bob will have as proper of a wedding as I can make happen out here in this godforsaken place. Mary frowned. I know you don't want to be here, Ma. Are you feeling any better about the trip? Her mother glared at the question. 2 of my children have been injured on this stupid trail. No, I'm not feeling any better about it. I want to turn tail and go back to Missouri where we belong, but your fool father sold everything we own to pay for this trip across the great American desert. It was the angriest her mother had ever sounded about her father. I think you're going to find that you're happy once we get there, Ma. I will I? My second oldest daughter is 4 years old, and she's sitting in the wagon with a broken leg. I will have to cook, clean, and do laundry for 9 people all on my own. I won't even have you to help me. Ma shook her head adamantly. This is a fool's errand, and I fear we'll never make it there alive. I sure hope you're wrong, Ma. Mary squatted beside her mother in front of the fire. I did get 2 deer, so we'll be having venison for supper tomorrow. Well, that's something, but it doesn't allay my fears for the next few months. I just hope we don't lose any of our own. I don't think I could keep going if I lost one of my babies. I know, Ma. I know. Mary got to her feet, accepting 2 bowls of beans from her mother. I'll take Bob his supper, and we'll eat together. Pa said we could walk if we stayed within sight of camp. Her mother shook her head. Just don't tell him you've wandered off together already, all right? He would not be happy. I wouldn't tell him that, Ma. He'd take it out on you and tell you that I wasn't raised right. Mary had never been pleased that her father tended to take his anger out on her mother more than anyone else. She'd tried to stop it many times, but it simply didn't work. Ma sighed. Just do as you're told, and we'll both avoid his anger. Mary had no idea why her mother was still with such a domineering man, but she said nothing more. Instead, she walked to Bob and gave him a big bowl of beans. Where would you like for us to eat our supper? She asked. We have to be within sight of camp, right? He asked. We do. We could go sit with your friend Jamie if you'd like. Mary wasn't particularly fond of Jamie, but she knew he was. Hopefully Bob would be willing for the 2 of them to be partners, like Margaret and her Tom had been if she let him make small decisions. That'd be nice. Bob led the way toward Jamie, and the 2 of them sat down near him. Jamie raised an eyebrow at seeing the 2 of them together. Are you trying to tell me something? Jamie asked. Bob nodded emphatically. Mary has consented to be my wife. The wedding will be Sunday. Don't wear your straw hat. Jamie frowned, touching his hat. I like my straw hat. That's because you're an odd man, Bob said, reaching out and holding Mary's hand. Shall we pray? Jamie immediately lowered his head, and when Mary had done the same, he thanked God for both their meal and for the bride who had chosen him. We're not doing anything special for the wedding, are we? Bob asked. He wasn't sure how they could really do something special out there on the trail, but women had strange ideas about things. Mary shook her head. I sure hope not. Ma might try to cook a big meal or something, but mostly we'll just get married. Bob started to tell her he wanted the two of them to sleep away from the camp on their wedding night, but Mary seemed a little skittish about talking about consummating their marriage. Besides, Jamie was listening, and the other man wouldn't be sleeping with a new bride on Sunday night. Poor man. Jamie looked between the two of them. I hope you're very happy together, the man said with his Irish accent. He'd been raised in New York, but both of his parents had been Irish immigrants. We will be. Bob refused to think about him or Mary being unhappy after they married. They were going to be the only married couple in the world who never had fights. He was sure of it. As soon as they'd finished eating, they took their bowls back to her mother. I'll help with dishes, Ma. Her mother shook her head. No, you won't. You're courting this week. I'll do most of the chores myself. Yes, Ma. Mary couldn't complain that she'd be getting out of the chores she so hated. She grabbed her musket for their walk, and her mother frowned. Leave the musket, Mary. When you're with the man you're going to marry, he has the right to protect you. It shouldn't be the other way around. Mary put the musket back where it had been, feeling almost naked without it. Yes, Ma. As they walked away from her mother, Bob took her hand in his. I hate not having my musket. I feel naked without it. Bob felt like telling her he wished she was naked, but he decided that wouldn't be proper. I promise I will never complain if you want to carry your musket with you everywhere. As far as I'm concerned, that musket is part of you. Why would she keep it from you? Mary sighed. Now that I'm marrying, I think she expects me to be more like her. Cooking every meal, doing all the laundry, not shooting the meat for supper. Mary kicked a clump of dirt. If I'm stuck doing women's work for the rest of my days, you might as well shoot me now. I'd be miserable. Bob laughed. You can do what you like, he said. I even like that split skirt your mother pretends she doesn't know about. Mary grinned. So, you won't complain if I work our homestead while wearing trousers? He thought about it for a moment. As long as you put on a skirt for church and if we have company we know is coming, I think that would be just fine. You're going to try to accommodate my strangeness, aren't you, Bob? She was excited. The man really did seem to understand her and accept her with all of her flaws. I'll do my best. Believe it or not, your happiness is important to me. I want you to be able to do the things you enjoy, and do them with a smile on your face. There's no need for you to be locked up all day in the kitchen when you could be out with me. And you won't get angry if I kill an elk and you miss? He shook his head. You don't threaten me, Mary. You and your musket are both welcome in our marriage. He wasn't much of a hunter, and since she was, she could bring in all the game they needed. Mary pursed her lips, thinking about what he'd said. She wasn't completely convinced he would continue to feel that way after they were married, but she could only hope that he would. Do you think I'm allowed to kiss you while we walk within sight of the camp? Bob asked, feeling a little frustrated with the courting. I've never courted anyone, and I don't really know where your father will draw the line. My advice is to keep your lips and hands to yourself. You may hold my hand, but I would think my pa would be very upset over anything else. Her pa had always been overprotective in a lot of ways. She never quite knew what to expect from him. Bob nodded. So where can we still be close to the camp where your pa can't see us? Behind a wagon or something? Mary laughed softly. Pa isn't going to be happy you're even thinking that way, Bob. We'll be married in just a few more days. You can wait that long to kiss me. Fine. Bob continued walking with Mary, feeling like everyone in the camp was watching them. Did you ever learn why Mrs. Scott was so upset yesterday? It was the death of Mrs. Henderson. I think she'd half convinced herself that our wagon train would be the first to not lose a single person. And then she looked at those orphan children, and she remembered how terrible she felt when her father died a couple of years ago. Mary shrugged. I didn't take her death as hard as Hannah did, but I think if I'd lost my pa unexpectedly, I might have. Bob nodded, finding it strange that the pastor's wife had responded so strongly as well. I hope she was doing better today. Oh, she definitely was. We were able to laugh a little even. Well, until Annie broke her leg. 2 of my siblings have now gotten hurt on the trail, and both on my watch. Mary shook her head. This is a long trail. I'll be surprised if there's anyone who doesn't get sick or hurt before we reach Oregon. No one can walk that far without something happening. We've had 2 big accidents, and now a death. No one said the trail would be kind to us, and it's been good compared to some. That's true, Mary said. I just feel like it's my fault the children have been hurt. I hope that things are quieter for a little while. She rubbed the back of her neck. Oh, and I need to make sure you realize that I'll still be doing chores for my parents. Ma can't take care of everything on her own. That's why they wanted me to come. With such a big family, there are only 3 girls, and the other 2 aren't much help because they're so little. I figured you'd have to help them out as we go. It only makes sense. No one can do that much laundry and cooking. I'm sure you'll still take them meat. I expect our eating arrangements will stay the same. Ma will still cook for both of us, so of course I'll be taking them meat. She looked at Bob. I've never seen you kill an animal. Do you enjoy hunting? He shook his head. I'm not much of a hunter, to be honest with you. My aim isn't very good. I could work with you on it, she suggested. No one is going to expect us to have a normal courtship. I could teach you to shoot. He laughed, shaking his head. That would be a bit too strange even for us, Mary. I guess it would. It would be fun though. Do you have any idea how much I enjoy shooting? She got excited even talking about it. I'm not even a little surprised. I see you with your musket, and you look happy. I don't think my ma realizes that the reason I carry my musket everywhere is because I hope to find food. I'm not afraid of Indians or anything. Well, I figured that, but I can see where your ma might be confused. He looked toward the camp and saw many people watching them. I was hoping no one would be watching, and I could sneak a kiss. I don't think that's going to happen tonight, though. She grinned at him. That's too bad. You did get a kiss by the river earlier, remember? You're just going to have to live on the memories of that for a few days. When they finally returned to camp, her father looked at her. You look awfully comfortable walking with Bob. You don't let him touch you, you hear? Not until after we're married, Pa. I know how to be a lady. I just don't like to. She couldn't believe he felt the need to tell her that again. She'd been told the same thing since she'd started to grow breasts. Her father narrowed his eyes at her. I hope you don't think I'm going to let you get out of this wedding. It's your job as my daughter to marry to become a good wife. I don't want to hear about you doing anything else. Nothing at all. Yes, Pa. Mary looked at Bob, who was trying to hide a grin. May I kiss his cheek goodnight? Since we will be married in a few days? Her father looked between the 2 of them. All right, 1 kiss on the cheek. Nothing more. Yes, Pa. Mary couldn't help but wonder how her father would feel if he realized she'd already been kissed on the lips by Bob. Twice. She tried not to think about it as she turned to Bob and stood on tiptoe, kissing his rough face. He hadn't had a beard when they'd started on the trail, but he was starting to grow a nice long one. Mary wasn't certain which look she liked better, but for now it didn't matter. He would grow a beard, because there was really no alternative on the trail. After saying goodnight, Mary got into the tent with her sisters, and Annie started crying. "I have to go." Mary nodded, and helped her sister out of the tent. From there she carried her down close to the water, and set her sister on a log, helping her to adjust her dress so she could go, then carrying her back. Annie sighed on the way back to the tent. "I miss having outhouses." "I do too, Annie." "I do too." Chapter 4. April 18, Sup, th/Sup, 1852. I got married today. I'm still not sure that marrying Bob is the right thing for my future, but it does feel nice when he kisses me, and knowing we can finally be alone without my pa's eagle eyes watching everywhere we step is nice for a change. Hannah picked me a bouquet of wildflowers to carry as I walked toward Bob in my Sunday dress, which is blue with tiny little flowers all over it. I never would have thought to describe the dress here, but Ma told me I'd want to remember what I married in. I don't know why, but I went ahead and noted it to appease my Ma, if for no other reason. Bob looked handsome. He was wearing his Sunday best as well, and Jamie was standing beside him. The two of them looked like they were about to find mischief to get into, but I can't let that bother me too much. We married just before noon, and the preacher used our wedding as church services for the week. A couple of people complained, but I really don't think they have a right to. It's not like we're paying Jed Scott to be a preacher for us, and he's doing all the same chores everyone else in camp is doing. Captain Bedwell told us last night that we're a week away from the Platte River. He wants us to keep going 20 miles per day as long as we can. Since we've been fortunate enough to have Sundays off to rest, it hasn't been horrible. Jamie's wagon broke an axle yesterday, and we were stopped for 2 hours for that, but Captain Bedwell insisted we walk later into the night to make up for the lost time. Thankfully, we have a blacksmith in the company, and Mr. Jensen took care of the axle with no fuss. I've written a lot today, but I think it's simply because I'm stalling. Bob says we're going for a nice long walk after supper, but I know why he really wants to walk, and I'm not sure I'm ready for it. I want to keep writing, just to stall him, but I know it's better to get things that I dread over with quickly. Mary was nervous when she woke on the morning of her wedding. She still had to help with the laundry, but there would be little else she would be allowed to do work-wise that day. Ma had proclaimed that a bride should be treated like a princess on only one day in her life, and that was her wedding day. Just before lunchtime, Mary's mother and Hannah sat her down and got her ready for the wedding. Margaret had drawn her a bath while Ma pressed her dress, and Hannah went searching for flowers. Then the two women she was closest to, Ma and Hannah, had set her down and Hannah fixed her hair while her Ma made sure there wasn't a lick of dirt left on her face. "I wish your hands weren't so brown, but I don't suppose it can be helped since we're on the trail," Ma said with a frown. Mary didn't mind that her hands were brown, and she refused to worry when Ma told her she was getting so dark she was going to look like an Indian. She certainly wasn't going to start wearing gloves everywhere like her Ma had suggested. Gloves were for city women in the East, and Mary was anything but that. While Hannah worked on Mary's hair, she pointed to a small bouquet of flowers on the back of the wagon. "You'll carry those instead of your musket," Hannah had said. Mary made a face. "Even I know I can't carry a musket down the aisle when I'm getting married," she said. She wished she could though. Just when she was walking toward Bob, she would see a herd of buffalo, and without her musket to take one of them down, she still wouldn't have a buffalo. It still annoyed Mary that she hadn't been the first of the wagon train to get a buffalo. No, that had been the preacher, who rarely hunted. Mary had her gun at the ready all the time, but the preacher had been in just the right place when a herd went past. There was no point for anyone else to shoot one of the creatures after the pastor did. He'd already brought down enough meat for the whole camp for days. Mary sat still as Hannah tugged on her hair, and she had to wonder if the pastor's wife was going to do her hair the way her own had been done on her wedding day. She hoped so, but she didn't say anything. Instead, when Hannah was done, Mary's hair was still hanging down around her shoulders. It had been brushed perfectly straight, and she felt like she'd been toyed with a little too much. Mary thought about reaching up and musing her hair, just a little, so she'd look like herself, but she knew better. Hannah would just make her sit down again. When the two women had finished fussing with Mary, she stood up and picked up the flowers. "You know these will do us no good against an Indian attack." Hannah smiled. "There hasn't been a single Indian spotted close to our company yet, and you know it. Stop worrying about Indians, and realize that there are enough armed men in our group that no threats will get close." Ma smiled. "I think I like your friend, Mary. Just don't gang up against me." Mary looked down at the skirt of her dress, which was not the split skirt she preferred. Her ma had yet to notice that she wasn't wearing a proper skirt most days, and that pleased her. Hannah and Bob had noticed, but they were more observant than most. Bob told her that her mother had chosen to pretend not to notice, and that worked for Mary as well. She just didn't want to have to explain why she was doing it. "Just remember that you have to let your husband have his way tonight. It doesn't matter if you like it. It's almost like doing dishes. You just get it over with as quick as you can." Ma told her that as she straightened the blue sash around her waist that certainly didn't belong on the trail. "Thanks, Ma. That makes me feel a lot better about the whole thing." Mary was already panicked, and her mother's advice wasn't helping one lick. Hannah smiled at her. "Don't worry. It's not a chore to get over quickly if you're with the right man, and I truly believe Bob is the right man for you. Your wedding night is going to be special and something to remember." Ma looked doubtful, but Mary was pleased when her mother didn't contradict her friend. She was nervous enough about their wedding night. When the sheets that had been hung down between wagons were moved, Mary took Pa's arm and began the slow walk toward Bob, who was standing between Jamie and Pastor Jed. Bob had never looked quite so handsome to her, and she was nervous. As she passed the odd girl with the peppermint stick in her cleavage, the girl whispered, "You'll have beautiful babies." Mary wasn't sure if she should stop and respond to the girl or just keep walking, so she kept walking. When she reached Bob's side, she took a deep breath and stood beside him. Her pa took her hand from his arm and put it in Bob's. Pastor Scott smiled, and it was odd for Hannah to see him in his pastor role when she'd gotten so used to him as her friend's husband. "We're gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Mary did her best to pay attention to the vows she made, and she smiled when Bob looked deeply into her eyes. When they were pronounced man and wife, Bob pulled her into his arms and dipped her backward for the kiss they'd both been waiting for. Oh, they'd sneaked a few kisses here and there, but mostly they'd been good and followed her father's edicts about not kissing. Bob pulled her to his side and slipped an arm around her waist. It was obvious he wasn't about to let her leave his side all day. "I have to throw the bouquet," she whispered. Bob shrugged and turned them both around, and she threw the bouquet, noting that her friend Margaret caught it, but after a moment of sheer panic, Margaret handed it to her daughter Sally, who accepted the flowers happily. Margaret really hadn't been widowed long enough to remarry. At least that's what she'd told Mary, and judging by the ages of her children, that comment made sense. Still, Mary wished she could see her friend be happy. As they walked through all the people in the camp to get to the meal waiting for them, Mary again passed the odd girl with the peppermint stick. She just wished she could remember her name. The girl stopped her. "I know it doesn't seem like it's right yet," the girl said, "but I think that you and Bob have done the right thing by marrying. You will make beautiful children together when you have marital relations." The girl's mother looked shocked at her words, but her father seemed proud. Mary said, "Thank you," and kept walking, determined not to have that discussion when she was with the man she was about to have relations with. Who would let a young girl say something like that at a wedding? A buffalo had been brought down by Mary's father the previous day, and her mother had worked hard to prepare a feast from the great animal. Everyone had food and enjoyed the meal, while Mary was embarrassed. She didn't want to be the center of attention. Sure, she and Bob had married, and they liked each other, but it wasn't a normal marriage as far as Mary was concerned. They had married because her father had insisted on it, not because they were so in love they couldn't not marry. Jamie stayed close to them the entire party until the music started. As soon as the music started, Mary and Bob were expected to start the dancing, and she went gracefully into his arms. She was so glad she hadn't stumbled, because she was so nervous. Bob spun her around wildly, and she laughed and followed his lead. She did so love dancing with Bob. And playing cards with Bob. And walking with Bob. He was a good man, and she enjoyed his company. It didn't mean she was falling in love with him, she promised herself. After the dancing, Bob suggested they take a walk together, but Mary knew what he wanted to do, so she said, "I think it's customary for the bride and groom to be present at their own wedding party." "I suppose that's true." Bob looked disappointed though, and Mary tried not to feel bad about it. As they danced and whirled the afternoon away, Mary was taken into her father's arms for a slower dance. "I want you to know I'm proud of you for marrying, Mary. I know that's not what you wanted, but it's the right thing for a girl your age to do. You put it off longer than you should have." Mary frowned. "I don't know why you want me to marry, but I have now. We'll get a bigger homestead, and I will still help my husband with all the men's chores, and it will be as if I have my own homestead." She couldn't let him think he was changing her life by forcing her to marry. She was still going to do what she'd planned to do. Her pa shook his head. "Now you'll have babies, and the babies will calm you and make you start acting like a woman whether you want to or not." Mary sighed. "I hope not. I wouldn't mind a child or two, but I don't want to have as many children as you and Ma. It seems to make her life so much harder." Her pa groaned. "Children are a blessing from God, Mary, and you would do best to remember that." Suddenly, Mary had no desire to have marital relations. If she could put them off, then she wouldn't risk having babies soon. She looked over at Bob, who was standing beside Jamie and watching her dance with her father. The look on his face was filled with desire, and she knew she was never going to be able to put him off for more than a few hours. No, the man was expecting her to have relations with him that very night. She thought hard for a way to anger him so he wouldn't want to do that with her, but there was nothing she could think of. There was no one she could ask. Hannah just kept telling her she'd enjoy it, and Hannah was the one person she felt like she could talk to about this. She was trapped, and she needed to do what she'd agreed to do. There was no other solution. After her dance with her father, Bob came back over and took his rightful place in her arms, having her dance with him. She happily moved close, and the two of them impressed everyone with their unique ability to dance together. Once the dance was over, she said softly, "Can we talk?" Bob gave her a curious look, but he nodded and led them off the dance floor to sit quietly while still in view of the party. "What do you want to talk about?" "I really don't want children right away," she said softly. "My pa is sure that they'll calm me down and make me more fit to be his daughter, I think." "Do you think they will?" he asked. He was willing to talk about ways to prevent babies if she'd found some, but he wasn't about to put off the wedding night. She shrugged. "I don't know, but I really don't want to find out. Maybe 5 years down the road, we'll be able to have kids once our homestead has been built up, but not before. At least I don't think we could possibly do it before." "Do you?" He frowned. "And you know how to prevent babies?" He had no clue how, and he didn't want to think about it. As far as he was concerned, babies were part of marrying. I do know I can't have them if we don't consummate the marriage. Bob stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Are you thinking that we'll be married, sleep side by side every night, and never have relations? You're crazier than a loon. He shook his head. We're not waiting another day. Mary sighed. I just don't like the idea of all of my freedom being taken away from me as soon as I find it. You'll have your freedom, he said. I don't care if you run around shooting buffalo while you're pregnant. I just don't think there's any way the two of us can keep from making love for long. I'm willing to try if you are. Mary smiled sweetly at him. No way. I married you today, I'm making love with you tonight. That's how it works. You don't wait for months or years to consummate a marriage. You do it on your wedding night, and that's that. All right. It was worth talking about, I guess. Well, I sure don't think it was worth discussing. In future, if you have any brilliant ideas that mean I can't touch my wife, feel free to keep them to yourself. Bob was annoyed with her for even thinking it would be okay. Did she think he married her so he could look at her and never touch her? The woman was maddening at times. I'm sorry I've upset you. That wasn't my intention. She thought for a brief moment about arguing with him on the top and deliberately angering him, but she knew better than to fight with her husband. Oh, I'm not upset. I'm just not agreeing to anything that crazy. Bob nodded toward the dance. Do you want to go and dance more, or do you want to get a blanket and go for a nice long walk? I'd rather dance, thank you. Mary was determined to put it off as long as she could. She understood now what he expected of her, but she didn't have to like it, and she could enjoy her own wedding celebration for as long as she wanted to. Bob leaned over and kissed her once, hard, on the lips. Don't you spend today trying to get out of your wedding night. It's not going to work. Mary sighed. All right. I'll try not to spend the day thinking about it. It seems like it's a simple enough thing to request though. Simple for you. I've been dreaming all week about finally getting my hands under your dress. Mary, you've been driving me a little bit crazy since I first laid eyes on you, and I'm ready for us to be intimate, whether you think it's a good idea or not. Mary nodded and got to her feet. All right. Let's go dance. When they got back to the crowd, Mary noticed that Hannah was dancing with her husband, and she was looking at him with a silly expression she always saved just for Jed. Mary wanted to know how she stayed so very much in love with her husband when she had to let him do that to her every night. After the dance, she moved away from Bob and she caught Hannah by the elbow, pulling her away from everyone else. Hannah looked at her with surprise. Is something wrong, Mary? Yes, something is wrong. Bob isn't going to let me get away without being intimate with him tonight. I don't want to do that. It sounds perfectly disgusting, and when I've seen cows do it, the heifer never seemed to be fully enjoying herself. Mary was grasping at straws, thinking about cows, but she had no idea how else to explain her overwhelming fear. Hannah looked like she was trying not to laugh. Well, I will say when my mother first told me about it, I wanted to throw up. But then I got close to Jed, and I'll honestly admit that I look forward to it as much as he does. Really? You're not just saying that so I won't be worried? Hannah shook her head adamantly. Have you ever known me to just say something so you wouldn't be worried? I mean, really, Mary. We've always been fully honest with each other. Please tell me you didn't ask Bob to wait. Mary looked away from her friend's knowing face. Maybe. Well, he's probably upset now. He wants to think that you want it as much as he does. Just let him kiss you, and soon you'll want it too. I promise. But, it doesn't look comfortable for the cow. Mary knew her argument bordered on the ridiculous, but it didn't seem to matter. It looked uncomfortable. Hannah grinned. I don't know if cows enjoy it, but I'll tell you outright that I do enjoy it. I think it's something a very loving God provided for us. It feels good, and it makes babies. But where do you put your hands? Mary asked. She was ready to start crying right there and then, and Hannah didn't seem to understand her worry. I'm not answering any more questions. No one answered them for me, and I do just fine with my husband. You'll do fine with yours. Hannah turned to go back to the party, stopping only when Mary put her hand on her arm. Yes? Thanks for putting up with my curiosity and worry. I know I'm a little silly, but I really am nervous. I was too, Hannah said. In a few hours it'll all be over, and you'll wonder why you were so nervous about it. Mary was still skeptical, but she nodded. Perhaps she could go and find Margaret and beg her other friend to talk to her about it. She wasn't certain Margaret would give her any more information than Hannah had, though. Bob caught her before she was able to find Margaret. What are you doing? You know you're supposed to be spending your time with me at the wedding party. I do know that. I just want to talk to my friends. No, we're going to dance. Mary bristled. Are you telling me no? I thought we were partners in this marriage thing? He groaned. We are partners. Can't you talk to your friends tomorrow? We're going to be on this trail for another 5 months or so. You're going to be sick of talking to them before we get to Oregon. No, I'm not. I want to settle near them, and I'll be auntie to all of their babies. Mary liked the idea of having her friends' babies to play with. And they'll be auntie to ours? Bob asked. Mary frowned. That too, I guess. How was she going to be able to convince him that she wasn't ready for babies, and she wouldn't be for a while yet? He took her hand and pulled her toward the dancing. Let's show them how it's done. As much as Mary loved dancing with Bob, it wasn't what she wanted at that moment. It didn't take her long to start loving what they were doing, though, and soon she was laughing with pure glee as Bob spun her around the prairie. No one else danced quite like Bob did, and she loved it more than she could express. When it was time for supper, everyone went their own way, but Ma fixed supper for Mary and Bob. You'll be back to helping me tomorrow, Ma told her when she offered to help fix the meal. Today is all about being married. Yes, Ma. Mary and Bob took their food to a small section of land and sat down to eat. There was no wedding cake, but Mary didn't mind. She'd never planned to marry, so the lack of a cake meant nothing to her. Why should it? As they finished eating, Bob said, I'll take the bowls to your mother to wash. Why don't you get a blanket and we'll go for a nice walk? Mary bit her lip. Already? It's just now supper time. Bob groaned. We're having a late supper. Most of the tents are up and people are sleeping. We'll sleep together under the tent I brought with me tomorrow night. Tonight, we're going to go make love. No more procrastinating, Mary. Mary nodded. It was time for her to do as she'd been told. She stopped at her family's wagon and wrote in her journal, dragging out what she had to say to take a bit more time with it, and then she grabbed the blanket she usually slept under and her musket. She couldn't put Bob off for another moment, no matter how much she wanted to. She walked in the direction he'd gone, off to the south of the camp. She was glad he'd chosen to go where they'd already been, because she felt like she knew the dangers that way better than she knew the dangers any other. She found Bob just outside of camp, and they continued walking until they were about half a mile away. Why did we have to come so far from the others? She asked. It didn't make sense to her to go all that way. So, they don't hear what we're doing. I thought you'd like it better that way. Mary looked at him curiously. Do you plan to be loud? Why would anyone hear them? It simply didn't make sense to her. I can't promise either way, he said. All right. How do we do this? She asked, feeling stupid. Didn't your mother talk to you about making love? He asked. Yes, but she said to just close my eyes and let you do what you wanted, and then Hannah told me that her mother said the same thing, but that's not what Jed wanted her to do. I've seen what cows do, but the heifers never look like they're enjoying themselves, and I really don't want to have babies right away. All of that is going through your head right now? He asked. She nodded. I've never been one to think simple thoughts. My mind starts running away from me, and I just can't get it to calm itself down. He stroked her cheek. Maybe we shouldn't try to force anything, he said. How about we just kiss? We both like that. As much as he wanted to just grab her in his arms and have his way with her, he knew she'd never be able to get over her fears if he tried. No, he needed to go slowly with her. We do like that. Are you sure that's what we should do? Does kissing lead to the marital act? I've never seen the cows kiss. Why couldn't she get the stupid cows out of her mind? He was going to think she was crazy as a loon. Bob chuckled. Mary, I think it's time for you to forget everything you've seen cows do, and everything your mother has told you. Just come over here and kiss me. Mary shrugged. That I can do. She walked the 2 feet between them and wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him with everything inside her. When he responded, taking over the kiss and deepening it, she moaned softly against his lips. Why did it feel so good when he kissed her that way? Soon they were plastered against one another, still kissing, and he stroked down her back, cupping her buttocks in his hands. That's something else the cows don't do, Mary said. I thought you were forgetting about the cows? I just can't stop thinking about how the bull melts the cow. I only saw it a couple of times, but it just doesn't seem pleasant. He shook his head. Mary, my wife? You need to get over your obsession with cows so we can enjoy our wedding night. Fine. I've stopped thinking about cows again. He sighed. But you've ruined the mood. Why don't we just lie down and go to sleep? There are other nights when we can consummate. If he could get her mind off consummating, then he was certain they could make it work. She just had to stop thinking about cows. I think that's a great idea. The woman was going to drive him batty with her talk of how cows reproduced. That was all right though. He had a couple of other tricks up his sleeve.